Hey everyone, welcome to iLife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. Now in today's video, we're going to talk about video from the photographer's perspective. What you need to know to get started with the video capabilities of your camera. And I'm going to give you that breakdown right after this. Now in today's video, something a little different because we're not going to really talk about photography. We're going to talk about videography, but we're going to do it from the perspective of the photographer. There's so much going on with cameras these days that some of the things can be a little intimidating. And the point of this video is going to be to explain 3 concepts around videography and get them to make sense to you practically. This is the Practical Photography channel. It's the Practical Wildlife Photography channel. But this, you don't really need to be a wildlife photographer for this one. At the end, by the way, I am going to show you some examples around videography as it pertains to wildlife. And I'm going to show you some specific examples, some case usage. But we're going to start with 3 parts of videography, and that's going to be resolution, we're going to talk about frame rate, and we're going to talk about formats. Now, some of this can get really, really complicated, and I'm going to try to do this in about 15 or 20 minutes. So stay with me on each part of these because I'm going to use this side over here to show you some practical pictures and some illustrations and some actual video, and I think all of this will make sense by the end of it. Now, when I do these videos, there's going to be a lot of information that I'm not going to cover. And there's going to be some technical stuff here. I'm going to try to gloss over that technical stuff. And we're going to deal a little bit more with concepts than actual technical detail because people get lost in that. There is going to be some technical detail in here, but I'll make it as simple as I can. Let's start with just resolution. Resolution is pretty easy for photographers because we understand resolution. We understand pixels and how wide they are and how tall they are. But I want to put an illustration up here to show you some common resolutions for videography and what they stand for. So we'll talk about this first bottom box as the high definition box. It's kind of a standard, an older standard. You might hear this referred to as 1080. 1080 referring to the narrowest dimension of this. So typical high definition, standard high definition would be 1920 by 1080. And then it increases in size. So you've got some standards around 4K. You've got 8K. There's also 2K video out and 6K video. By the way, I want to put this out there because as I stream this to you, you are watching a specific resolution. If you go down to the bottom of YouTube, there's a little dial down there or a gear, and you can select that and you can pick the resolution. And if you do that right now, you'll see that there's different options. And you take me down to 680 or 640 rather, you're going to see the quality of the video change. And now select the highest one. If you select that, you're going to see a difference in quality right away. That is the size of the video that I'm sending out. If you dummy it down, so in other words, if you watch it smaller, the quality is going to suffer, especially if you watch it small and then try to make it big. It's going to look really, really wrong. And we call that pixelation. So we understand as photographers, we know what pixelation looks like. It's when you shoot something small and then blow it up big and it doesn't look too good. So I want to talk about resolution real quickly. A couple things to understand is, as those numbers, and I'll use 2 even numbers here, 4K and 8K. As I change those numbers from 4K to 8K, you can look at the little illustration over here to see it. I'm not talking about doubling the amount of information. It's going to quadruple it. So it's twice as wide, but it's also twice as tall. So 2 times 2, 4 units bigger than the original. It's going to be 4 times as large in terms of data, approximate data. If I use that first resolution, that 1080p, that high definition, and then I go all the way up to 8K in terms of just data and information, I'm going to have 4 times the width of the resolution, but I'm also going to have 4 times the height. That's 16 times. The image will be, or the final video will be 16 times as big, but it will also contain 16 times as much data. Now, a couple things about these. So more is better, of course, right? Well, more isn't always better. One thing we have to remember with, just like with photography, is if I have a lot of resolution, but I print it really, really small, the resolution almost becomes irrelevant. Similarly, if I were to shoot something in 8K, I have to think about what is the viewer watching it as. Because if they're watching it on a small monitor, 8K isn't going to make a difference. So there are times when using higher resolution is good. And certainly I'm not telling you that to shoot lower resolution as a default, but just understand that having a big number like 8K or there's now even 12K, but having these huge resolutions isn't always going to be practical as a videographer. The people watching it may not ever appreciate it. And if you were viewing 8K on a screen, it would have to be really, really big to take advantage of that. For a 40-inch TV, for example, there's very little difference in what you can see between that 1080p and the 4K. Like there's really just not that much of a difference when you're viewing it from 10 feet away. Now, if you got really, really close and got it really, really big, that's when you would see the difference. So keep that in mind as we're talking about resolution. Now, there are some cases where shooting at a higher resolution has its advantages. I'm going to talk about some of those. I'm going to show you some practical advantages at the end. But for resolution, I think we're good here. I think if you look at that over there and you understand it and you kind of get a sense that there's a lot of information when you get to 4K and 8K, and I may not need it all, know what your output is going to look like, we should be okay with the basics of resolution. By the way, when I shoot with my camera, my mirrorless camera, I'm a Nikon shooter, by the way, but when I shoot, I typically shoot in 4K. Even though one of my cameras is available to shoot in 8K, I don't use it, but there are some use cases that I could. But 4K is kind of a good standard for me, even though I really don't display it in 4K, and I'll show you why at the end. All right, let's move on to frame rate. Now, when we talk about frame rate, we're talking about frames per second, and there's a couple things we should understand. One is, what does our mind, or visually, what do we perceive as motion? I want you to imagine you're the kid, and I don't know if you ever did this, but I certainly did. You make these little stick figures on pieces of paper, and then you take your notebook and you flip them up. I guess young people can't appreciate this stuff, but back in the day, these are the fun things we used to do at the back of the school class. Now, if you flip those pages real slow, so if you had like 20 or 30 little stick figures and you flipped it real slow, it would look choppy. You know, like the animation wouldn't look smooth. But if you flipped it really, really fast, it would look smooth. So our mind is kind of like that. The way we perceive motion is like that. And so when we're looking at video, if we've got somewhere around 24 frames in a second, so 24 images stacked against each other showing motion, we will perceive that as being pretty fluid. A standard is 30 frames per second. I say standard because if you're watching movies, you're watching YouTube, you're watching TV, the chances are you're seeing it viewed at 30 frames per second. That gives you a very nice feel for that motion in the video. There are people that shoot in 60 frames per second, but for the most part, anything over 30 frames, I don't want to say it's unnecessary because people will argue with me, but there are reasons for it. But you're not going to notice much of a difference. So if you go from 30 to 60, sometimes it even looks hyper realistic. So when I view something at 60 frames per second, you can see it's a little different. But we're going to use 30 and 24 as some standard numbers. When you look at the back of your camera and you're selecting frames per second, my best guess is you're going to have an option for 24, maybe 25 also. You have an option for 30. You're probably going to have an option for 60. You might have an option for 120. And if you've got a really great camera, maybe you even have an option for 240 and 300. Now, Scott, you just told me 30 is the standard. You told me that I can perceive 24 frames a second. Why do I need 120 or 240 or 300? And the reason is because, not that we're going to show it to you all the time at that, but it gives us the ability to slow it down. Let me explain this. 30 frames in 1 second, and I show you that 1 second. And now take 60 frames in that same 1 second, but do this. Take that 1 second and space it out into 2 seconds. So slow it down by 1/2. So now we have 30 frames in the first second and 30 frames in the second second. So we've got a 2-second video played at half speed. Let's go to that example of 120. If I had 120 frames per second and I wanted to slow it down 4 times, I would still get 30 frames per second. And that 1 second video is now 4 seconds long and it's 4 times as slow. And it's simple math. In fact, if I wanted to go down to 24 frames per second, because I told you I can still perceive that as motion, I could make it 5 times as slow. If I had 240 frames a second and I wanted to go down to 24, I could make that 1 second video 10 seconds long and be 10 times as slow. It's simple math. So the reason that some people choose to shoot at higher frame rates is knowing that in post-processing, or as a wildlife photographer, or in some cases videographer, if I want to show my wildlife in slow motion, it looks really, really beautiful. I have the ability to do that. So I can determine later on whether I want to slow that video down or do I want to keep it at the normal speed and maybe just process it or export it at that 30 frames per second without changing the speed. So a couple things under frame rate, a couple key things I would just want you to take away. Understand 24, 25 frames a second is about what we need to see motion. 30 frames is the standard. Anything above 30 frames might improve the motion quality, so it might look a little smoother, but the real advantage might come in, especially for a wildlife photographer or for somebody who has slow motion applications. The real advantage may come in that I can slow it down divided by 24 or divided by 30. So I can slow it down 120, I can slow it down 4 times, 240, I could slow it down as much as 10 times. One other thing I want to point out is when we talk about frame rate, there's a couple things you actually need to know as the videographer. The frame rate that you choose will be the inverse of your shutter speed. That'll be the minimum. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If I choose 30 frames per second, my shutter speed can only go down to 1/30th of a second. As a rule, you should double that. Now, I didn't realize that when I first started doing video years and years ago, and then somebody told me that, and I was like, oh wow, it kind of made sense for the reason they explained it, but it's going to give you the ability to capture the frames a little sharper. Each frame will be captured a little sharper, and so you won't get a little bit of blurring in the video. So just know that. Now what's interesting, and I'll talk about some real case scenarios at the end, but what's interesting is as a wildlife photographer, I often think of my shutter speeds as 1/500th of a second or faster, 1/1000th of a second. As a videographer, I can get comfortable with the mindset that I might be shooting as slow as 1/60th of a second and producing video, which means I may not, and if you understand that exposure triangle, I may not need as much light in my scene. So early morning, late night, dusk and dawn, when wildlife is most active, I might be able to capture a scene and I might be able to have enough light because I haven't made that shutter speed so fast that it's going to darken the overall image. So just something to think about. I thought I'd throw that in here while we were talking about frame rates because I told you I wanted to give you a couple of practical nuggets in this one. So we're down 2 out of 3. We've talked about resolution, pretty easy. We've talked about frame rate. Once you get a couple of the basic understandings, really around 24 and 30, you start to have an understanding of where those other frame rates come into and how they can play. But we're going to talk about formats next. And this one's going to get a little tricky, and I'm going to try to keep this one extremely simple. Of the 3 topics, this is absolutely the most complex topic we will deal with, but I'm going to try to make it real simple, and I'm going to try to do it in 5 minutes. So here we go. There are several factors to consider when we talk about format. Think of format as the file and how it's created. So you're going to get a lot of options on this. I'll go into my camera. I'm actually going to show you the back of my camera, and I go into the video settings, and I get a lot of options in there. So these first settings that you're seeing, this is a Nikon Z9. First set of settings you're seeing, there's that frame rate and there's that resolution. We already covered that. The next thing is going to be the type of video that I want to record. How am I recording it? For photographers, think of JPEG versus RAW. You know, most photographers understand that JPEG is a compressed format using a lot less information. RAW is maintaining or retaining all of the data from the original sensor. It's actually what the sensor recorded, and then I get to go in and manipulate it. Video is similar, but way more complicated. There is a RAW feature in video, and I'm not going to spend much time here. What I need you to understand with RAW video is that it's going to be processed. It's actually going to need to be decoded. Because when you record the actual, you're not getting an output. You're not getting a video out of the camera right now. When you record in RAW, you're getting numbers. You're just getting data. That data needs to be extracted. It has to be read, and then it has to be digested, and then it has to be edited. So with video, RAW has a ton of advantages, but it is a very large format to deal with, and it has to be edited, and it requires some skill. If you're a beginner, you're not going to start in RAW formats. You're just not going to use those. As you advance, but again, that's going to be a lot different than where we're at right now for a beginner and an intermediate. As you advance, maybe you get there. But I'm going to mention RAW, but I'm going to kind of throw it out the window. And all you need to know about RAW is it's raw data. It's not a finished product, and it has to be edited. It has to be digested by some software later on. And we're going to talk about compressed formats. Compressed formats are, there's actually a video JPEG, but they're similar to JPEG for photographers. This takes information and it encodes it and compresses it, and it takes away, it strips out some of that data so the files aren't so big. It does it a lot of different ways. I'm not going to get into the methods of compressing files, but just know that it literally takes that data and removes it. And sometimes it keeps key components from each frame. Sometimes it dummies down each frame and makes each frame into kind of like a JPEG. There's a bunch of different ways that it does this. What you need to know is that it's much smaller than a RAW format. So you get a lot, you can take longer videos and it's not going to use up as much hard disk space. And there are things called codecs that are going to decode and encode those. So I want to talk about this term codec real quick, because you're going to see this term and I want to break it down and make this real simple. Codec. Code, decode. That's what it stands for. There are dozens of different popular codecs out there. Each camera manufacturer may have some proprietary ones. So depending on the brand of camera you have, it might be different than what I'm going to talk about in this video. But there's a couple of standards, and I'm just going to mention two. H.264 and H.265 are pretty standard codecs that most cameras are going to have. Know that the 264 is a little older and the 265 is a little newer, and they may involve something called a bit, B-I-T. You may see 8-bit, you may see 10-bit, you may even see in other formats 12 and 14. So we've talked about codec. It's a thing that compresses a file. It's like an algorithm. It compresses the file, but it also has to decompress it. And that gets on the editing side. I'll talk about that in a minute. Know that the higher that the bits are, so if you have like 264 8-bit versus 265 10-bit, the larger that number, the more color depth you will have. Think of it as just like a quality issue. You get more color possibilities with 10-bit. You get more with 12-bit and you get even more with 14-bit. That codec is going to be packaged. So there's two parts of a file format. There's an extension. I'm going to mention a couple of popular ones. You may have seen these on your files. MP4, AVI, MOV. There's one called FLV. There's tons of these extensions. But think of that as only a package or a container, or I'll use an example of an envelope. It's the outside. It doesn't tell you what's inside. So the contents could be really good contents in there, or they could be really poor contents in there. With photography, sometimes I can look at a file extension and get an idea of quality. So if you're a photographer and you understand JPEG, you might know that a PNG file is generally a little higher quality, and you might also know that a TIFF or a TIFF file is even higher quality. And I can kind of tell that just by the extensions. With video, it's a little different because those extensions are almost meaningless. Your camera has to know how to read the extension, but it doesn't give me an indication of what's inside. What's inside is going to be that codec. So for this example, I could have an H.265 10-bit MP4, or I could have an H.264 8-bit MOV. It really wouldn't matter what the extension is. That's just how the computer is going to end up reading it. What matters is what's inside. Now that's compressed and raw, and there's also one in the middle, and I'm making these into very large categories. There are a lot more compressed formats out there. There's a lot of RAW formats. To know a RAW, by the way, it's almost always going to say RAW. So it might say Sony RAW or NRAW, or it might say ProRes RAW. It'll always say RAW in there. There's also an intermediate format, which is also a very high quality format. I'm going to call this intermediate. You may hear a term called mezzanine as well. This is a little bit more advanced. When you've dealt with those compressed formats and you want a little bit more quality, take a look at things called ProRes or things called DN, and there's a couple different formats. I'll put it up here so that you can visually see it, so you can remember what these are. And I'll also put the benefits and kind of the use cases for each of these. With these intermediate formats, they are much higher quality, but they also are much larger. So these intermediate formats could be as much as 10 times the storage space of the compressed. So you get more ability to edit, and actually some of them are intended to be edited, but it's going to come at the sacrifice of more data. So the chart down below, I'll use a 1 gigabyte example. If I've got a 1 gig file for a compressed format, it could be as 10 gig file for mezzanine, and it could be a 15 gig file for RAW. That's the average across those three. However, it's also relative to the frame rate and the resolution. Because at the end of the day, all of this is data. So before we move out of extensions, I just want to recap. We've got raw, intermediate, and I'll call it compressed. There are other names for all of this, but these are this is the terminology I'm going to use. I listed a couple of the popular formats. This is not a limit. There are hundreds of formats out there. We talked about the bit rate. More bits, better quality. I should say better color quality normally is what it's associated with. And then the last thing we didn't really talk about is something called the bit rate. Bit rate, sometimes you can choose the bit rate or you can select things like high quality, medium quality, low quality, and that will often determine the bit rate. With video, since it's a series of images put together, the more data, the higher the quality output. The higher the bit rate, the more data, again, is involved. Higher the bit rate, better quality, but again, more data. I want to talk about, before we move on, I want to talk about and just kind of summarize data real quick. We've talked about three different factors: resolution, frame rate, and format. Each of those involves data. So for example, if I shot a high definition, a 1080p at 24 frames per second, and I used H.264 compression, I would end up with a very small file, relatively speaking. If I shot it at 4K with 60 frames a second, and I went up to a ProRes file, I would have a much larger. It wouldn't even be 10 times as large, it might be 20 or 30 times as large. And if I went to an 8K, and it's tough to get 8K 120, but if I was able to get an 8K resolution at 120 frames a second, just think about that. I mentioned 8K is probably 16 times the data, but now I've taken the 24 frames and made it 120 frames, so that's 5 times. It's like 90 times more data. Now I choose a higher file format on top of that. And so these images just become huge. I can take a 256 megabyte card, a gigabyte card, 256 gigabyte card as a photographer and shoot 10,000 images without even worrying about it filling up. As a videographer shooting high quality video with high resolution and high frame rate, you can fill up a 256 card in no time at all. You'll be amazed at how much data it can consume. So there's a lot to think about when we think about video. It's not just what's the resolution and the frame rate and the format. It's also, how do I store it? It takes a ton of storage. And how do I interpret it? Or how do I edit it? And I'm not going to do a video about the software right now. I just want to get some of these basic terms. More importantly, I want you to get your camera and just look at it and play around in those video settings. Understanding some of these basic things, like the basic format and the basic video and what that frame rate really means. Now I'm going to get into a couple of practical things. So this is actually like, now how do I use this information? Now practically the first thing I want to deal with is resolution. So I often shoot bigger than my intended output. I'll do a couple of illustrations over here. So the first thing I'm going to do, I just set this up and I went out into my backyard and I just filmed myself at 4K. If I did this for YouTube, so if I was making an outdoor video for YouTube and I'm going to stream it at 2K, why would I shoot it at 4K? Doesn't make any sense. Because just like in pictures, I can crop it. So imagine I shoot it wide and I don't like where I'm standing in the frame. I can simply just crop it. And I'll put the video up and I'll kind of draw a box around the 2K area that I could display it at. I could also move that box around. So I could move this video in editing and I could put myself where I want in that frame and make it a little bit tighter. And here's another example where I shot it at 6K. Now that's really a lot bigger. I only need 2K. Why would I do that? Well, there's another thing that I could do, something called like a jump cut, meaning that I could zoom into myself, and it's not really a zoom, but I could just cut into myself at a much closer distance. It's almost like having two cameras. So I can film myself far away, and I can do that jump cut where I become much closer. I could do it in a video like this, for example. If I shot this in 4K or 6K, I could do a tight headshot, and using the same camera in the same video, I could then just edit it so that I'm farther away again. So those are called jump cuts. Also gives me a little bit of ability if I want to zoom in and out, I could do that, or I could move the image left or right. I can do all that stuff because the image is this big and where I'm going to export it is only this big. So I have a lot of room to play around with either moving it or zooming it in and out. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So that's one use case scenario. Let me show you how I use it a lot, is right over here. There's a green box. The green box represents 4K. That's the size of a 4K video. The yellow box represents Instagram or TikTok. It's 1080 wide and it's 1920 tall. That's the output. Now, because I overshot it, I can use the video software to actually crop down to that dimension. That's what it's going to look like. So I can shoot big and then I can figure out where I want. The reason this is so helpful for me is I'm often shooting things like bees or birds. And if I were to say, well, I'll just take my camera, I know I'm going to export it vertically. That's what Instagram and a lot of social media take. By the way, I know there's some videographers out there like, oh, I can't stand this. You're probably right. But modern world, this is what we do. We view on iPhones, and this is the output that a lot of social media formats use. So if I want to get that vertical thing, I could turn my camera. So I could go from horizontal to vertical, and I could film it vertically. But now I only have this much room. So if the bee's flying across my frame, I can't track it, and it's going to be all over, and the video is going to look terrible. But if I've got 4K, and the bee flies back and forth a little bit, he's staying recorded the whole time. Then I take my video software and I just follow the bee at that 1080 width. So that looks like it. Let me put another illustration up here. This is an actual bee at 4K. That's what it would look like. If I were to crop it to 1080, I'll put a box on it. See the difference? So I can crop it and I can export it to social media. That is a use case. Again, I'm not saying that's the only use case, but that is a use case for overshooting video. It gives me a lot of flexibility. It's going to require more data, so I'm going to chew up a lot more data at 4K than I would have at HD, but as 5-10 second clips, it's not that much data. And that's basically, as a wildlife person in social media, that's what I'm doing. I'm just shooting short little nature shorts and putting them out for people to watch and appreciate some of the beauty. I'm also a native plant enthusiast, so I love to have these insects flying around in my native gardens. All right, so that's one use case. I talked about like the ability to overshoot yourself. So if you're recording, you overshoot a scene and you can crop into it, or you can crop it to different dimensions. So I can take a wide aspect ratio, make it a vertical aspect ratio, and I could export it to something like Instagram or TikTok. Now with frame rate, we talked about how much we can perceive as motion, somewhere around 24 frames a second. We talked about 30 being pretty much a good standard to use, but let's talk about some of these other frame rates and what they actually look like. So over here on the side, I have a scene that was shot at 30 frames per second. Or I'm sorry, at 24 frames per second. And it's just a stream of water. I have a little fountain out here. I'm going to take that same scene, shoot it at 120 frames per second, and then I'm going to slow it down 5 times. So 120 divided by 5 is the same 24 frames per second. Look at the difference. I'll put them side by side so you can see it. You see how it feels like really like peaceful, serene, and with some of my nature stuff, this is what I like to do, that nice calming effect. I'll loop the top one 5 times because that's what I'm going to have to do to make it the same length. So this top one, normal speed, looped. The bottom one, 5 times slow motion. Pretty good, right? Let me show you another example here. This is a bee that was out in my yard. I was just recording it. I liked the way he had this little proboscis and he was kind of like going into the flowers, and then he wiped his face down. Now, full speed, look at that. I mean, bee is moving fast. You watch insects move, they move really, really quick. But I wanted to slow this down a little bit. And since I'm going to export it to social media, I did exactly what I told you I'm going to do. I combined the frame rate and the resolution, overshot the resolution, overshot the frame rate, slowed it down, cropped it in. And then I get a little image that I can put out on social media that looks something like this. Now, again, I am not a videographer. I just like to share nature. So this video wasn't intended on how to be a high-level videographer. You are going to go to school for that, or you're going to study a lot for that, or you're going to have to watch a ton of YouTube videos. This is really just, what can my camera do? Can I understand what it does? And then how can I use it for what I do? Whether it's exporting to social media like I do, or creating YouTube videos, or whatever the use case you have is. So that's up to you to figure out. So I thought I would put a couple of these examples up there. I hopefully you found that helpful. I'm going to kind of wrap this up and just ask you to go down in the comments a couple things. Did I explain those premises specifically around resolution, frame rate, and formats, knowing that there's a lot of other information out there? Now, anytime I do a technical video, I always get afraid that somebody's going to go down in the comments and get it a little too technical for the audience. Just remember, this video is for beginner and intermediate photographers learning about their camera and how to take video with it. So hopefully you found that part helpful. But again, you can go down in the comments, you can leave some technical things down there if you like, or clarify anything that you think needs clarification. I'm always happy, by the way, to take the best comments that clarify a part of this video and pin it to the top. So if you put in a great comment down there, I'll pin it. But you got to remember, it's a beginner or intermediate audience. It's got to be really simple so they can understand it as well. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I have a lot of playlists. So I've been doing some of these photo basics, in this case, kind of a video basic, but I've been doing some of these videos. I've got opinion pieces as well. I do a lot of gear reviews. So check out the playlist down below. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. I think that's it. I think that's what I got for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.